Kia ora koutou, ko Ayla Barfoot tōku ingoa. Welcome to this month's Hot Take, which is a special two-part Hot Take, where we have this first one this week and a second part next week, and we're focusing on different ways of looking at ethical investment within an individual lens and a business lens. So today, we're very lucky to be joined by Shannon Barnes from Mindful Money, who's going to give us a bit of a discussion on KiwiSaver and how we can all make sure that that money that we're putting away is going to what we want it to and making sure it aligns with our values. They've also been doing some awesome research at Mindful Money, which Shannon's going to talk us through as well. So thank you for joining us today. What we're going to do as usual is Shannon's going to speak to us for a while, give us some information, and then we'll have lots of time at the end for Q&A. So feel free to pop questions in the chat if anything pops up in your mind as we go through, and we'll get to them in the Q&A section. Or you're most welcome to pop your camera on and your microphone on and ask a question out loud at the end. Thank you all for joining. I'll just keep admitting people, but I'll pass over to you now, Shannon, to kick us off.
Thank you, Ayla. Kia ora koutou, ko Shannon toku ingoa. Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you all for joining me today. As Ayla was saying, I work for a charity called Mindful Money as the research analyst. And so I'll be talking to you today about how to use your money as a force for good and put it towards the things that you want it to put it towards that can have a positive impact on the planet. So big opening question to start off with. So do we know where our money is going? So most people in New Zealand have a KiwiSaver. There's about 3.8 million Kiwis that have one. And many people are also invested in retail or managed funds as well. So what funds do at a high level is invest your money, which is amalgamated in a pool with everyone else's money, into companies they hope to support and derive a financial return from. So if you're invested in a company through a fund, you're essentially giving it social license to operate. So that's what we mean when we say where New Zealanders' money is going. And a lot of the time it's really tricky or time consuming or not the most fun kind of weekend activity for New Zealanders to figure out, firstly, where their money is going, and secondly, whether they would actually like to be supporting the companies it's going to. So that's where Mindful Money comes in. We want to do that hard work for New Zealanders so they know exactly where their money is going. Just to start off, every year Mindful Money surveys the New Zealand public and publishes a report alongside the Responsible Investment Association of Australasia, or RIA for short, which details what the public's perception of ethical investment is and where they want their money going to or not going to. And it's a really robust survey, and we've built up quite a bit of data over the years, but the trends are very much the same year to year. So 3/4 of New Zealanders want their KiwiSaver or other investments to be managed ethically. And that's pretty consistent across both gender and generation. And over half of New Zealanders would be willing to move their money to a different fund if their investment does not align with their values. So a lot of people have it on their mind, have been thinking about it, and want to know more about ethical investment. So in the survey, we also find there is kind of a commonality each year amongst the types of industries New Zealanders want to avoid their money going towards each year. So you can see high on the list there is human rights violations, like labour rights abuses. We don't want those things in our investments. High up on the list also is environmental damage. And if we go down a few more, we see fossil fuel production and fossil fuel power generation. And that's a lot of what I'll be talking about today, is kind of where that money is going towards to support those industries. This kind of graph shows what the public wants, but in reality, our money is being used to support industries that 75% of New Zealanders don't want. And these are things like fossil fuels, human rights abuses, animal testing is on there as well. So things like testing for cosmetic purposes, which use really invasive, harmful tests on animals. And this graph is just KiwiSaver as well. We have other figures for retail and or managed investment funds. So it's even more money than just this. And so even though down the bottom it says 9.5% of total KiwiSaver funds are invested in these kind of issues, this still adds up to billions upon billions of dollars every year. So it's a large amount of money we're talking about going towards these companies that New Zealanders don't want to be supporting, and essentially giving them that social license to operate. So I'll just quickly do a bit of an interactive exercise now to show you what the Mindful Money website looks like and what it would look like to check a fund. So hopefully this works. If I click on it, there we go, opens it up. This is what the Mindful Money website looks like, and you can go in and check a fund. And so when you sign up to KiwiSaver, if you don't directly choose your fund provider, you might go into one of the default funds. And so these default funds are the largest funds in New Zealand, hold billions and billions of dollars. So I'll just quickly check the largest one, which is the ANZ Default Growth Fund. So if we click on that, choose it, we can go into the fund details. And we've just changed our website up as of last week to show a bit more information about why these companies are listed. And so if we go in here, we see that 4% of this fund is invested in fossil fuel companies. Another 4% is invested in companies that are being cruel to animals. And you can go down and it'll display the companies in terms of the category of concern, and then also listing kind of more information about the subcategory that the reason they're listed in. So for human rights violations, you can hover over it and see that, Nestle is listed for human rights abuses, whereas Eva Pharmaceuticals is listed for public safety concerns. You can see, Bayer is listed for environmental harm in terms of GMOs, but also for highly hazardous pesticides. And we've also just updated the website to show, so for the fossil fuel companies, there's companies that are either on a 1.5 degree pathway aligned with limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. There's also companies that are involved in expanding their production, which I'll touch on a little bit more in a moment, but these icons essentially show if a company is on that pathway or if a company is not aligned with it and expanding their production. So you can also click on companies that are highlighted. We're slowly adding more and more information about each company. So an example, you might click on Contact Energy and it brings it up and shows you exactly why Contact is listed for fossil fuel power generation, and a bit more about what they're doing and how they might be aligned with a 1.5 degree pathway. So that's just a quick overlook at one fund. You can see there's many, many companies in there, and they add up to, a pretty high percentage of the overall fund. So if I click here, it might go, oh, sweet, goes right back to the presentation. So we'll just keep carrying on. I thought I'd quickly just touch on this fact here, and I think the wonderful Bryony will talk about it more in her part 2 of the hot take next week. But essentially, I really hate to put the onus of climate crisis on the individual, but the stat is pretty alarming, and that it's your KiwiSaver fund is likely the second biggest contributor to your carbon footprint after travel, which includes air travel. And so what I'll be touching on today is kind of how easy and how quick it is to bring this metric right down and give you a really powerful, tangible action you can take with you today to reduce your carbon footprint. So when we put money into KiwiSaver, we are giving it to a fund manager to do the hard work and invest it for us. And so their job at the core of it is to try and make a return on their investments. So by the time we go to withdraw our money out of our KiwiSaver when we retire, or when we buy a house, we would have built up more money over time than the actual amount that we put into it. So we know that our KiwiSaver balance might go up and down day to day, but it will essentially go up and down and to the right, so increasing over time. And that is kind of what the benchmark of the share market does. And so that light green line at the top, that is a kind of benchmark for companies in the share market. And you can see they go up and down day to day, but over time they are kind of growing in terms of returns and revenue. And the dark blue line at the bottom there, that is the same kind of benchmark, but just for oil and gas companies. So you can see they too go up and down over time, but over the past like 10 years, they've gone down instead of up, they've gone down. So losing money, losing returns. And that's the general trend of the fossil fuel industry. It's a declining industry. We know that we're going to have to transition away from it if we want to keep living on this planet. And so any kind of investment into fossil fuels, we know will return a negative return over time. So going back to that ANZ growth fund, it's pretty crazy how we bring it up, and there's still lots of fossil fuel companies in there, when essentially if you're putting money into that fund, you're kind of putting your trust in the fund manager to make a positive return, and investing in industries like fossil fuels aren't going to do that over the long run. So yeah. So last month we published a report about the state of fossil fuel companies in terms of what they're doing for climate goals. We went through and did research on hundreds of companies and found that most are not aligned with climate goals of the Paris Agreement, despite making lots of net zero commitments or net zero kind of ambitions. And instead, they're actually doubling down on their core business and throwing billions towards expanding their production and exploration for new fossil fuels each year. And this comes despite the world's leading climate scientists and energy agencies pointing out that there is already enough production capacity available for the near future, and that we urgently need to stop any new production or exploration if we want to stand a chance at staying below that 1.5 degrees of warming above pre-industrial levels. So at the moment, we're currently sitting at about 1.1 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and we've already seen devastating climate events here in Aotearoa and overseas. And if we were to carry on the trajectory of kind of what we're doing now, the climate scientists are saying that we're going to hit 2.8 degrees of warming this century. So you can imagine how catastrophic that would be if we're already at 1.1 degrees. Yet, most of the major oil and gas companies have billions of dollars planned for new short-term production, and in contrast, they aren't investing anywhere near as much in renewable energies or kind of looking at options to transition to lower carbon forms of energy. Sorry, there's just someone knocking at my door. So out of all the companies we looked into, hundreds of them, close to 1,000 actually, we only found about 8 companies that are on a pathway aligned with keeping global warming to below 1.5 degrees. So 8 companies out of close to 1,000 is a very small statistic and pretty alarming. So these are just some case studies of who these expanders are. We name a few of them in the report, so if you did want to go have a closer look at them, they're in there. So these expanders are spending anywhere from $1 to $4 billion US each year on exploration alone. So as an example, ExxonMobil, they produced around 1 million barrels of oil equivalent in 2021, but their short-term plans would expand their operations by an additional 7 million barrels of oil in the next few years. And so it's quite a large number that we're talking about, a large amount of expansion. So most of these major companies have made climate ambitions and saying they're going to transition to more renewable sources of energy. BP even changed their name recently from British Petroleum to Beyond Petroleum to kind of show that they hope to be serious about going beyond petroleum and investing in more renewable energy. Shell also made one of these ambitions. So they made an ambition to cut their oil production by 2030, but they've recently backed out of this commitment, which means that Shell alone as a company will be adding almost as much annual emissions of carbon dioxide each year as the entirety of New Zealand. So that's just one company, emitting as much emissions as an entire country of New Zealand in a year because of the plan to cut their commitments that they've made. So I went back, so as I was touching on before with the graph about the individual's carbon footprint, there's only so much that we can do as individuals. the onus really should be on these major companies that have the ability to make these huge changes at that large scale. And, you know, with these companies expanding their production, they're essentially like putting short-term profits above their own climate ambitions and the targets of like global agreements. So yeah, it's pretty alarming. And also it's not just the climate risk from added emissions that's shocking about, you know, the lack of action or urgency from these companies, but also the financial risk their activities pose too. So in a world that's moving towards decarbonisation and has to, due to the crisis we're facing, you know, increasing fossil fuel production creates the risk of stranded assets for these major companies in the future. So, you know, when the time comes in the future that we absolutely have to transition to renewable energies, they're going to be left with a lot of stranded assets and no money left over for investment in renewables. So we had a Mindful Money conference last week, and there was a panel that I was on, and one of the questions was, should New Zealand even be allowed to invest in fossil fuels? Which is a big question, but you know, essentially I touched on the topic of, you know, for me and for other young people, we've got a 40-year time horizon before we think about taking our KiwiSaver out for retirement. So that's a long time. So we want our investments in KiwiSaver to be growing over time, and to invest in companies that are going to be losing out on financial returns is not something that people would want in a long-term investment. So for young people, it's a pretty obvious choice that we should be, you know, divesting money away from these kind of companies in our KiwiSavers. And yeah, through our research, we identified 8 thermal power generators that are on this 1.5 degree pathway and leading this transition. So these are electricity utilities switching their production to more of like solar, wind, geothermal, and have clear goals to be completely renewable by 2040. And there are no fossil fuel producers currently aligned with the 1.5 degree pathway. It's only power generators at this stage. And the one company that attracts the most New Zealand investment out of these 8 companies is Contact Energy. So they're due to phase out their oil and gas power stations over the next few years and invest heavily in geothermal power instead. Another company example is Ørsted. They're a Danish power company. So back in 2009, I think it was, they produced about 85% of their electricity from coal, but since then they've transitioned to being the world's largest offshore wind power generator, and now over 90% of their energy is from renewable sources. So these companies show that it's absolutely possible and kind of can be done to transition away from oil and gas and towards renewables, and it's also in their best interest to survive and thrive as a company to get onto transitioning as soon as possible. The report also highlights kind of the state of New Zealand investment in these 2 different types of companies, so the expanders versus the ones that are in transition. So currently of New Zealand's investment in fossil fuels overall, that is across all like KiwiSaver and managed funds, about half is in companies that are expanding their production, while only about a quarter is in companies in transition. So to contrast, that's about $3 billion in expanders versus about 1.7 billion in companies in transition as of September 2022. So yeah, investment in fossil fuel companies expanding their production far outweighs our investment in companies in transition. And even though the share price of oil and gas has gone up over the past year due to you know, the war in Ukraine, New Zealand's increase in investment in the expanding companies is more than double this. So, you know, it's increased from about 80% over the past year, from September 2021 to September 2022. And going back to our annual survey about what the New Zealand public want, you know, 75% of people want their investments to avoid the fossil fuel production sector, and around the same amount want to avoid power generation by fossil fuels as well. So our report highlights that, you know, much of the fund management industry kind of remains fixed to, you know, short-term returns after this crisis in Ukraine, despite, you know, the poor returns of the fossil fuel sector over the past decade and the exposure to all sorts of financial risk as well. So yeah, currently the state of New Zealand investment isn't reflecting, you know, what New Zealanders want or what they would expect from the fund management industry. And a key message we really tried to convey with this report is that it's really important that the investment industry in New Zealand kind of gets rid of that short-term mentality and actually looks at the bigger picture of the coupled climate and financial risk from investing in these companies that are not in transition. And at a time when like the leading scientists are saying there's no time to waste in transitioning our energy sector to renewable sources if we want to meet these climate goals, it's pretty concerning the role the New Zealand investment sector is playing in this. Another report that we've recently published was on the role of investors in funding kind of global deforestation. So currently there are plenty of companies out there driving deforestation in the tropics. These companies are highlighted, some of them at the top there, and they're mainly companies in the beef, soy, palm oil, paper and pulp, timber, agriculture, and mining industries. And those are industries that are driving deforestation, kind of clearing land on the ground. But there's also a number of food and kind of agri-food companies which are involved in deforestation through their direct suppliers or through their supply chains. So even though many of these companies have put strong deforestation policies in place for their own operations, they may still be linked to deforestation through their supply chains due to things like local corruption or lack of law enforcement in these countries, and also traceability and transparency across a major supply chain is really complex. So it's really hard to know, what's actually happening on the ground. And so these companies have been exposed to all sorts of environmental damage. And these companies are funded through the financial industry and through banks. And so we found that as of September 2022, there was $68 million of New Zealand's KiwiSaver and managed fund investment money in these companies driving deforestation. So here in New Zealand, we really are having an effect on the state of the planet globally. And just to touch on, I guess, why it's an issue, deforestation is a major risk to biodiversity in terms of species lost, but also to the climate because forests absorb carbon. And so when we cut them all down, we're releasing carbon back in the atmosphere and kind of inhibiting our ability to absorb carbon as well. Recent research has showed that half of the economy, the global economy, is dependent on nature. So nature kind of underpins a lot of key industries like agriculture, tourism, forestry, things like that. Companies are also really exposed to the risks involved in damaging nature. And also deforestation is really linked to human rights issues due to the violence and kind of corruption involved on the ground in these places, particularly to Indigenous peoples who are often driven off their lands or even sometimes killed in land disputes over deforestation or trying to protect their land. So it's a really important issue. And we hope that by publishing reports like this one and the fossil fuel transition or denial report, that we raise awareness of where New Zealand's money is going and really shed some light for both individual investors like you and I with our KiwiSavers, but also fund managers to show them the current state of New Zealand investment and where there is room for divestment from or engagement with these companies doing harmful things. Kind of to wrap up the tail end of this presentation, Mindful Money really just kind of aims to do two things. One is to bring transparency and awareness to the public, so empowering individuals and the public to know where their money is going and to have a choice to change it if they're not okay with what they see. And number two is we hope to drive kind of collective change and kind of transition the financial sector or the financial industry to be more sustainable because we really need that in the world today. So the first point, transparency and empowering individuals. So looking at some more stats from our annual survey report, about 60 to 70% of New Zealanders either don't know what ethical investment is or have heard of it but are not quite sure what it means. So that's a large number of people that don't know about this, and so we want to bring that transparency to people and kind of empower them to know a bit more about where their money is going. And we want to make ethical investment accessible to everyone, and do that kind of harder research work for you. So figure 18, the second one, shows that again around 60% of New Zealanders think it's important to them to know what companies they're invested in. So it's of high importance to people. So that's what we hope to do. So on our website, I showed you before, we have a fund checker, but we also have a fund finder that does that hard work for you. So we recognize that, ethical investment looks really different for everyone. Ethical is a very subjective term, and people have different values. And so when you use our fund finder, you can kind of click on the issues that apply to you. So you might want to avoid, say, animal cruelty and human rights, but you're not so fazed about social harm in terms of alcohol or tobacco. So you can kind of screen out the things that you don't want, or you can screen out everything if you don't want anything like that in your investments. And you can also, and then, so you use the fund finder and it'll bring up a few different options that might be suitable to you. And you can also put in things like past returns if that's important, or your investment risk profile. So if you're conservative, balanced, or growth minded for your KiwiSaver or for managed funds. So it'll bring up a few different options for you and provide a bit more information about the funds and what the funds are doing in terms of engagement and other things, as well as just the exclusions. So it's free, takes under 15 minutes. It's like the quickest thing you can do. And also there's a bit of a myth, I guess, about switching your KiwiSaver being a difficult or lengthy process, or you might need lots of paperwork or information. I was really shocked to find this out when I first found it out, but it doesn't cost anything at all to move funds. So to change your KiwiSaver provider, all you need to do is complete an application form for the new fund, and that's pretty much your name, IID number, an email. So you don't even need to know who you're originally with. All you need to know is who you want to switch to and your IID number, which is pretty easy to find. And so it's a really quick, tangible action you can do in under 15 minutes to have a really big impact on your carbon footprint, and also how you feel about where your money is going. So the second thing we hope to do is transition the sector to be more sustainable. So this is just a kind of a graph showing the state of what a fund could look like. So there's like the red side and the green side. So the red side is traditional funds. So I guess back when the fund management industry kind of started, the main thing for them was to derive a financial return. So things about the environment and society weren't really on the cards. It was more so about what will make us a financial return and make us money in the long term. So that's kind of what a traditional fund would focus on. And we're hoping to move the sector towards that green side. And so the next thing a fund could possibly do is to avoid harm. So screen out negative things. And so they might have policies of, we don't want fossil fuels in our fund, so they'll screen them out. The next or equal best thing they could do is engage with companies. So they might still be invested in, say, a fossil fuel company like Contact, but they might be engaging with them in terms of, voting on shareholder meetings, or engaging with them to change their behavior or change their ways, or kind of business trajectory. And the next best thing they could do is invest in companies which have better standards. And so there is also a bit of a myth that investing responsibly or ethically means that you won't derive as much of a financial return, or you'll kind of miss out on returns if you invest in companies that are doing good things, which is a complete myth. There's a lot of research that's come out to kind of bust that myth. And we know that investing in companies which have higher ESG, so environmental, social, and governance scores or values, will derive a higher return over time. And that is because environmentally, they're not degrading the environment, so they're not exposed to all sorts of regulatory fines, or they're not exposed to climate change risks. Socially, they're good, doing good things in the community. They're not going to face legal battles. And governance, they would have, happy workers working for them, so the company is going to thrive into the future. So companies that have high levels of those things are going to be around for a long time, derive a more positive financial return and impact on the planet. So we want funds to move towards those companies. And also the very green end of the diagram is a thing called impact investing. So that is investing, into companies to directly have a measurable and positive impact on the planet while still driving a financial return. So yeah, we hope to transition the sector towards that green end, and just some examples of what impact investment might look like. Things like social housing, renewable energies, and investing in positive things for communities. So ideally, we want to live in a world where money is used for what people actually want. So going back to our survey, we see that most people want to avoid the bad things and invest their money ethically. So it would be great if one day, mindful money didn't have to exist and the whole sector was just focused on positive impact investments. And this is my kind of final slide here to wrap it up. I thought I'd just put that first bit in there as more of like a positive kind of personal note. So for me, I come from a like an environmental science, environmental policy kind of background. So I've studied and worked in that area for a bit. And I found that my role here with Mindful Money has been like what I thought has been making the most positive impact on the planet out of anything else that I've done. And that is because we are doing those two things every day. We are empowering individuals to put money where they want it to go to and avoid the things they want to avoid. And we get messages from people all the time saying, we can't believe that, this information is accessible. I've changed my KiwiSaver fund to something that aligns with my values, and it's just the best feeling. And then also we are slowly changing the sector to be more sustainable. I think we held the Mindful Money annual awards last week, and that's something that we hold each year. And funds are nominated for categories like Best Impact Fund or Best Ethical Fund, and the caliber of nominations year to year is just getting so much better, and there are funds out there doing really, really good things. And it's just showing that the sector is shifting slowly, and we're having an impact on that. So it's a really cool feeling. And yeah, our aim is just to make money a force for good, both at that individual level, so you and I with our KiwiSavers, and then also at that industry level as well. So just to wrap up, Mindful Money allows you to choose what your money supports based on what you care about. We know that ethical investment is subjective, so you can choose what aligns with your values on our website. We also have heaps of resources on our website as well. So we've got a kind of a learn page which has all those reports that I've just talked about published on there, and also information about like ethical investment 101 if you want to start at that basic level, right up the way to more kind of complex stuff if you did want any information on that. And we're also on the socials, so we have an Instagram, we also have LinkedIn as well. So if you have any questions after today or want to chat, my email's up there, but otherwise, yeah, really looking forward to your questions. Thank you for having me.
Kia ora. Thank you. That was so good. Really, really interesting and great to get a better understanding of that new report you guys have done. We will include links to those reports in the follow-up email so you guys can have a good read and kind of see in detail all the different things Shannon covered, but really appreciate that, Shannon. We have had a few questions come through, which I'll get to in a moment, which is awesome. And yeah, feel free anyone to use the little raise hand function so that you can ask a question out loud if you like. But just awesome to see what a sort of win-win-win it is to do this. It's easy, doesn't take you long. I've done it, they're right, it's such an easy process. I loved the fact that doing this would be your second biggest carbon emitter in your personal footprint. So what an easy way to have a positive impact, and you do it once and then you don't even have to think about it again, not like making all the different tricky decisions every day. So that's a really awesome thing to do. And then awesome to be able to align that money with your values, and it is on the right track of making more money than its equivalents that are doing harm. So it just seems to be the thing that makes the most sense for everyone to be doing. Awesome. Okay, let me get started on some of these questions that have come through. So, Mark, we have a few from Mark. So, given 75% of KiwiSaver investors want their funds to be invested ethically and 50% would switch if it didn't align with their values, what do you think is holding people back from moving away from non-ethical funds?
Great question. I don't think we've done any like direct research on what the answer will be, but I can kind of offer maybe a few different thoughts of what it could be. There's potentially a lack of knowledge or misunderstanding that switching between funds would mean you kind of lock in losses or lock in, lack of financial returns. And also maybe the process is quite hard to switch. Also, they probably might not know how to do it. And so maybe there's a bit of a misunderstanding with the lack of information there. And also, probably just, especially after, I think, the war in Ukraine, we saw a massive increase in fossil fuel share prices. And so in the short term, it kind of looks like the non-ethical funds are doing really well because their returns have been good over the last year or two, but in the long term, we know that that's not going to be sustainable. So it might be like the short-term profits that people might be keeping them to non-ethical funds, but it also might be lack of information as well.
Yeah, I fully agree with that, Shannon. I think a lot of people who are probably younger and were in that first kind of push of KiwiSaver where we got $1,000 to get one set up, and then we've just never ever thought about it again. It just sits there and it ticks over and you don't really consider it. And so I think, if I can give everyone, go have a look for your own fund, but if you can share the Mindful Money website around and get everyone, thinking about this stuff as well, it's an awesome kind of impact that you can have as an individual. Do you want to add anything there, Mark?
No, I agree. I think there's a couple of things really that we found is that people just perceive that they're going to get less return. So as you said, there's plenty of research to counter that. And that complication, I think there's a real misunderstanding of how easy it is to switch. So I think the more we can get that message out, the better. So hopefully that will mean more people making that switch to something that's aligned to their values.
Yeah, definitely. We have a question from Rachel. Can Shannon please explain what stranded assets mean?
Good question. So when a fossil fuel company might invest heavily in some more exploration or production, they might put a lot of money into assets in terms of like a new oil rig or a tangible thing to extract more oil, and those assets will become stranded when they're no longer needed. So when they're no longer needed, these are things that you can't really use for anything else. And so, a massive oil rig, once you don't need it anymore, you can't use it for anything else. So it becomes stranded. And so the money that you've invested into it then becomes, debunked. So that's what stranded asset means in terms of fossil fuels.
You're on mute, Rach. Perfect. Rachel had another question was, and this is, if anyone from the audience, feel free to chime in, but does anyone know why the magic sat behind Ørsted making the major transition? How was that investment made? Partnership with the Danish government or private investment? So I guess that's when they did a pretty dramatic change, and they've been really successful, but does anyone know of how that change came about, if they did have further support? The transition from the fossil fuels, I mean, to
build on that?
Yes, please.
We're just going to make our little thing mute here. Shannon, I don't know if you know the answer to this, but we do a lot of work with Z Energy, who are really committed to these kind of transitions here in New Zealand. And I know it's super hard. It's really, really hard to get the scale of investment to even go into an electric future, which is something they're really keen to do. They've also been looking at a biofuels future, which is the diversity of the fuel mix that we might need in our country. but it's really hard. And I'm curious, and I've always been curious, how did Ørsted do it? Was it just really, really good private investment, or was that a partnership with the Danish government so that they could actually do that transition? Because the cost of transition can't be cheap, even though it's the right thing to do. Does anyone in this group know? Or Shannon, do you know?
Not off the top of my head in terms of partnerships, but I know they kind of
You're on mute,
changed their
Shannon.
whole like.
No, you're not, Shannon. I think it's
Okay.
there you go. You're good now.
Yeah, I think they changed kind of their whole business model, which really helps. So it is really hard, like you're saying, for fossil fuel companies when your whole core business is around extracting fossil fuels. You can't just kind of change overnight to be a new different type of business. And so I think with Ørsted, they really did a lot of work in the first instance to change their business model. So kind of their future trajectory of what they wanted it to look like in terms of renewable energies. And so they changed the core business model, but I'm not exactly sure what the partnerships were there.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat, Shannon, but we use them as an example often as that getting a bit more creative in thinking. There's a great quote from them that's something like, are we in the business of selling people coal fuel, or are we making energy? And so kind of having that like more creative lens across your business of thinking about whether, if you really look at the essence of your business, you can really have that more impactful way to view it, instead of being kind of dragged into how you usually do things, because often that's a real barrier for people, is changing the kind of system that they're in. But definitely a tricky thing to fully change your business model.
Yeah, and it was over the course of about 15 years. It wasn't just overnight. So that's the thing to consider as well, that these changes take time, but it also takes a lot of willpower to get that core kind of business model set at the get-go, which we know that a lot of the major companies aren't doing.
Yeah, and again, you mentioned lots in your presentation, that short-term view versus that long-term view. So they were able, long before other people were thinking about it, to have that longer-term goal, which is really admirable. We have another question here. Are you finding some managers pushing boundaries with their claims, especially with ethical or sustainable in the fund name, i.e. greenwashing?
The funds themselves. I think funds at the moment can make bold claims and also have exclusion policies in there to say that they will exclude fossil fuels. But I don't think there's much regulation around that, or there might be some regulation, but we've found on our through our research that even though some funds have exclusions for fossil fuel companies, we're still finding fossil fuel companies pop up in these funds, and it might only be like a few percentage of holdings, but it's still there. And so I think there's definitely room for like things to slip through the cracks here, and even if it's not intentional greenwashing, it can still come across as unethical.
Most definitely. Feel free to pop any questions in the chat. One of the questions I had as you were going through, Shannon, was you talked about, I think it was Shell backing out of their current commitments. Are there any repercussions for them from that, other than a sort of everyone knowing about it and hopefully being annoyed at them about it? But do they have any legal repercussions for that?
I'm not fully across it. I think it would depend on what they say and how they say it. But if it's just a kind of a claim or an ambition, then there wouldn't be any kind of legal repercussions, because it's just them saying that we are going to do something. We aspire to do something, but then backtracking on it. But also, we're finding that these companies are quite happy to make these bold ambitions, but then they're not so vocal on, what they're actually doing behind closed doors, or if they're backing out on it. So, we just want people to be more aware that, these companies can make ambitions and claims, but, they're not exactly going to be saying the next day, oh, sorry, we've backed out on it and we're going to be adding all these emissions. They just wouldn't say that kind of stuff. So. Yeah,
most definitely. And greenwashing across all industries and sustainability is pretty rife, and it's good to question all sustainability claims that you see and try and be across that as a consumer, although hard when it's coming at you from all angles, as different businesses have kind of decided that it's the best marketing tactic at the moment. One of the other questions I had was, you talked about how the investment in fossil fuels is becoming more and more of a risky investment. Are shareholders starting to put more pressure on the funds that they don't want to be seen putting that money into fossil fuels anymore, or are we still not seeing that kind of at the kind of, I guess, intensity that we need to see to make the changes?
In terms of people to funds, or funds to companies? Or
people to the funds.
Yeah, we're not fully sure of what the engagement is with people with their funds. We don't have that kind of information, but I would say that there are a lot of people out there probably going to their funds and saying, you know, I've found on the Mindful Money website that this fund is invested in a lot of fossil fuel companies. What are your thoughts on that? Or do you plan to change that in the future? So yeah, we really encourage people to get in contact with their funds if they do want to. And we have the information on our website when you check a fund or bring it up as to who the contact person is, so you can go directly to them if you have any views. And we do know that you know, there are quite a few funds out there saying that they are engaging with the companies that they are invested in to kind of get them to maybe change their ways or do things differently. But at the same time, there is a bit of, I guess, some greenwashing in that as well, because we found that, you know, a lot of fund providers might hold, you know, 1 or 2% shares or even less than that in a company, and they could be engaging with them, but you know, they're holding such a small amount of that company, which is still a lot of money, but you know, they're not exactly influencing the company to change their ways. And you know, to say that you're engaging just means you're engaging. It doesn't mean that you're engaging to change their ways. It could just mean that you're showing up and voting on something. Are you voting on the right things or the wrong things? It's really hard to tell. So I think, yeah, it's just people need to be aware of what funds are saying when they say they're engaging with companies as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because you're right. Engage. Sometimes we see sustainability being almost like a footnote at the end of a meeting, and so it could be just the tiniest mention, and then they can claim. Yeah, that's a good thing to be aware of. And I would definitely think when I switched providers, I made sure to let my previous provider know that the reason I was changing was because of the ethical kind of standpoint. And I think that's a really nice way as well. You can even have a little bit more influence as you do it. So you can go, I'm changing to this fund because they're more ethical, and that's, you know, why. Because unless we all start talking about it and making that known, they're going to keep just kind of going on as usual.
For sure.
Cool. Do we have any questions here from the audience before we wrap up? We probably have time for a couple more. No, that's so good. Lovely to see you all. And we have online today, which is lovely, Mark from Ethical Investing New Zealand and Bryony from Pathfinder, and they're going to be speaking to us next week for this part 2, which is today we tried to do that sort of individual KiwiSaver focus. Definitely want you guys to go away from today feeling really empowered around the decisions that you can make and the influence you can have by talking to people about this stuff. And KiwiSaver is, you know, a really great way to start thinking about it. But if you're interested in investing in other ways, you can just carry this through to that as well and kind of apply this lens across your money, which is often an area that people don't think about sustainability within. And so then next week, we're going to have both Bryony and Mark talking to us, and it's going to be more of a business focus. So what can employers do to support their staff in this kind of financial crisis that we're in, but also from an ethical standpoint, how you can help your staff to learn about this stuff more effectively. So we can push all the different buttons to get the system moving along, as Shannon talked to us about. I love that visual of us moving that system along. Awesome. Great. So I will include in the follow-up email the links to next week's hot take, so make sure to tune into that as well. Any of the reports that Shannon shared with us, and also a link to Mindful Money so you guys can go and have a look at your funds and make the switch. Shannon, do you have anything to add before we close off?
No, just thank you so much for having me, and yeah, it's really positive to see people engaging with this stuff, and we hope that, you know, in the future, like I was saying, we wouldn't have to have these kind of conversations because the whole industry would be like this, ethical side of things. So yeah, thanks for having me.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. It was really informative, and I'm sure everyone's going to go away and get right on that Mindful Money website to get looking at this stuff. Awesome. All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and I hope to see you all next week. Ka kite.
Thank you.
Thanks.